Somehow Comic Hour with your host, Andrew Glonner.
And Chris Ramos.
Tonight we have our special guest, our audio engineer.
The number 3.
RJ Halstead.
Yes, the RJ Halstead. RJ, tell us about your comic book experience. How did you get here?
Well,
Trapped.
How did I get here? Well, to be honest, this was pretty much, I consider this like my first book I actually read. With like the last, I don't know, 15, maybe 20 years, I probably haven't read a book completely all the way through by myself. So you guys kind of turned me onto this. I always wanted to get into reading. I just never knew where to start. And you told me, do Daytripper, just do a chapter a day. And that's what happened.
We had to find the right one. Daytripper is what we're talking about tonight. It is an amazing, amazing story. Came out in 2010. And it was kind of the perfect segue for RJ because it wasn't superheroes and it wasn't, any kind of other
Supernatural.
Or long history.
Yeah, he mentioned I don't want to do this or this. And then we were entertaining the idea and I just kind of went through the Rolodex and I was like, I just read Daytripper.
Yeah. Let's bring it up.
It's easy read. You just kind of do it.
Superheroes aren't really my thing. And it wasn't one of my main things. I've seen the movies. It's not like I don't watch the Marvel movies or things like that, but it's not my number one priority. I like stories that talk about life. I'm growing to learn that. That's
life
what I like.
And death.
Mm-hmm. and death, yes.
And that's where Daytripper. So Andrew, why don't you show or bring it in on who wrote it and when and all of that.
So Daytripper.
He likes doing this part.
Daytripper is written by Fabio Moon and Gabriel. These are two twin brothers from Brazil. And this was one of their very unique books, and they've went on to do many other things. And this is actually a Eisner Award winning best limited series.
You might know them from the Umbrella Academy. That's
yes.
Probably their more mainstream popular series, which came out years after this. But Daytripper is a incredible story that is usually in someone's top 10s. Like if you grab someone and said, hey, you've been a comic book reader for a while, what are your top 10 books? They'll pretty much, maybe talk about some classic Marvel, maybe grab into some DC, but then they'll be like Daytripper, Mouse, and Watchmen and Batman Year One. Yeah. And, there's sort of the beginnings of these characters and the beginnings of the story arcs. The nice thing about Daytripper was I believe it was always written to just be 10 chapters and that's it.
Yeah. No sequel, no nothing. It is what it is. And that's the beautiful thing about it, I think. I don't think you could ever expand this universe or go on a different concept. It is what it is.
Yeah. And we always try to talk about different formats, different ways to read Daytripper. It's been around for a while. It's been around for
a decade.
10 years at the time of this recording.
Yes.
And it is available in absolute format, which is DC's large,
oversized.
Yep, with edition. A slip case on it. And it's also available in paperback, hardcover, which is kind of hard to find, and digital. So we all kind of picked our own poison on this. I read it digitally. First I read it 3 years ago, maybe in paperback, and I read it all at once. And then later learned that's not really how Fabio Moon wanted it to happen.
Yes, and I read it as last year after I purchased it at a Comic-Con, and I read it. I binge read it even before this podcast. I couldn't dig reread of it, and I also binged it. I was like, just gotta keep going. Just gotta keep going. I gotta know. Which is not the ideal way to read it. And then how did you read it?
I read it chapter by chapter until the last 3 chapters. I couldn't just wait anymore. Like every single day, it got harder and harder. Like the first day I read the first chapter, I was like, oh my God, I'm remembering everything. I'm like, because I always had issues with like comprehension, and that's what like always steered me clear of like reading.
Yep.
But like the last 3 chapters were just I just had to
Right.
finish them.
I
and
always
it was
remembered
great.
like after you read the first chapter, second, third, and so on, you're like, this is what happened. Da, da, da. You
And-
gave me like the synopsis. Is like, oh yeah, I remember that. Yep. That
and
was
then
the time.
that I borrowed the book from you, and then I
Yep.
went out and I bought my own copy because this one's like my trophy book. Like this is the first book I read. I completed this one, so this is it's nice, and it was a good feeling to finish it. But after reading this book, I needed to cleanse my brain with something not so serious. But yeah, it was a great book, great read.
Yeah.
I was just kind of looking up. Each chapter is about 20 pages. So in the comic book world, that's, little
Typical issue.
pockets of paragraphs. And a typical normal issue of comics are between 20 to 25 pages. So it's right in the ballpark.
Mhm.
And Daytripper is written as a 10-chapter story that crosses over from one to the next, kind of jumps around in time, kind of jumps around with characters aging and de-aging, and then, of course, jumps around in its themes. But, we heard some time ago that you're supposed to read Daytripper 1 chapter a day. Read the 20 pages, put it to the side, and just think about it, reflect. And that's kind of how it's written. It's actually, and we'll kind of all bounce around on how we took it, but I like the idea that you can literally open up any page in Daytripper, just open it up, and there's going to be a phrase or a paragraph or a blurb that is pretty, I don't know, I don't want to say life-changing, but it's like a thought-provoking.
Yes.
It's such a well-written story, and they just literally, every sentence you could tell is trying to make you think about something, hit a nerve, or just have you soak it in. And it's beautifully done. So when you read 1 chapter, it's a pocket of time in the book that when you are thinking about it through the rest of your day, or if you read it and you think about the next day, you just can't help but to reflect on the lessons of the chapter, right?
Yep.
I would say that, yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, I loved how it started. I loved how the book started. And he's an obituary writer. Like, look up the book, read a little bit about it. Don't dig too deep, just pick it up and read it, because I love how it started. It starts off like telling you these stories about these people's lives, and then it tells you, and my name is Braz, I write obituaries.
The main character.
Yes. And it's like Ramos said, it really gets you thinking. Like I would literally go to work and I would get lost in my thoughts because I'm like, oh, what was I doing? Because I'm trying to figure out like what's happening in each chapter, because each chapter it had its own feel to it, and then you'd go to the next one, and it's really well done for sure.
Yeah, I would say so as well. Following the main character, Braz's story, you could even relate to it in your own life. I definitely recommended it. We were talking about this earlier outside of this recording about what a good age would be to read this story. And we talked about you almost have to be out of college to read this story.
Yeah, I think only because you need to have some sort of life experience. You always hear people tell teenagers that, you can't put enough emotion into a song about heartbreak and loss and, being married for 40 years because you're 19. So like sometimes it's hard to say, I'm going to put all of this emotion into that. So It sounds kind of weird to say, but you have to live a little to read Daytripper, because it talks about not living enough.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Very
So
true.
It's the meaning of life,
Yeah.
essentially.
And we're not giving anything away. The back of the book, and it's even if you look up the synopsis, the main character Braz, these are kind of lessons through his life, and at the end of every chapter, he dies.
Yeah.
And it's just what the story is. it got me because I've always had sort of this thought behind life and death and time and what we do with our time that we're here, and is there a way to um, build memories or keep memories, or are we always forming new memories that take place of our old one? Like, it's always intrigued me in that aspect. um, the really nice thing about Daytripper is it kind of casually brings you through the story. It's very calming to read, but at the same time, at the end of this chapter, something bad's going to happen. So you're kind of reading it and like expecting for the other shoe to drop,
Mm-hmm. And I think it's kind of cool to figure out, like when you first start reading it, and I went into it blind. I didn't know anything about this book, nothing. I didn't read the synopsis on the back or anything. And then when I started reading it, like Ramos just said, he would die at the end of every chapter. I was like, what is happening? Like, what, like, how is this possible? How is he still living? Like, what is going on?
Exactly. It's very ambiguous of how, if that is actually, is he dying at every chapter? Is he dreaming? What is actually happening? And it's sort of, they don't give you really a straightforward answer. Like, this is what we suggest that happens.
Yeah.
But,
and like, is it a fear that he has? Is it like a thing that is sort of like the culmination of his day? Like, because he writes obituaries, is he always thinking, this is how I would die? Because unlike superhero books, he ends up just sort of dying just pretty normally, right? Like accidents and things.
A lot of accidents.
Just things that could happen to anyone.
Yep.
And that is another theme of the book, is this story, this life, or these many lives could happen to anybody.
Yep.
And it's do you take the moments in your life and make them happen? Do you take the moments in your life and realize that this is your time? Because at any moment, a car could hit you. And so that's I think why a lot of people really pick up on Daytripper, and why it won the Eisner Award, and why it's always well respected, is because not only did it take the comic book medium and say, we can tell a strong story with cartoons, like we can tell this story, but it also says we can tell this story that will connect with everyone who is living, because they are the Daytrippers.
Yep.
And that's
what I really liked on before the story begins on the first page there. He says, you can't help but get lost in these drawings, but then the narrative forces you to question, does art enhance our lives or distract from it? And then at the bottom it says, but as the protagonist as Braz would say, writing about death was easy enough. There's far more happening in these pages, pondering the past, wishing for the future, but existing foremost in the existence. And it kind of makes you think and digest all that. It's like, whoa, what am I in for? And it's a completely new experience, especially for me reading like superhero comics and the fantasy world and things like that. Coming into this and like, whoa, I can actually relate to some of these stories that are going on. It's very real at the same time. So,
and like on the topic of art, I never thought I'd be a person to enjoy graphic novels. Like I've talked to you guys before and said, I don't know
just
about
picture
this.
books.
I'm like, that's nerd stuff. But no, I really do enjoy them now. Like I've purchased many other books,
yes,
in this short amount of time that I've started reading, and I probably have like 25 different books now.
One of us.
They're nice, but yeah, like I really do enjoy them, and like I said, I never thought I'd be a person to read graphic novels at all.
Sure.
Well, I kind of want to break down a little bit of the since we're on the artwork side, and we always talk quite a bit about artwork. Especially since I always
How would you describe this art? Range?
I put down some art sometimes that I was like, I don't like this. I don't know. My brain just looks at things and I say no. Anyway, this artwork it's the same team that did Umbrella Academy, and I love the look of the Umbrella Academy um, comic books. I have them in the library edition, which is larger in hardcover, and the artwork in this is a little more controlled.
Yes, it's not zany and wild.
Yep, it's the same artist. It's just that you can tell that they sat down and really took their time on it. And in the back of these collected editions, you always have sketchbooks and layouts and thoughts and scripts. And it's nice to have some of the extras. Fun fact, I read it on Comixology. You can buy 2 versions of it. You can buy the trade paperback, or you can buy the deluxe edition. And I'm like, well, what's the difference? But I got the deluxe because I always do.
Yep. Get more bang for your buck.
Yeah, you get a lot of that backstory, and you get a lot of the sketchbooks and all that. So, so to go back to the original question, this artwork perfectly fits the story.
Yes.
And I totally approve of it because they have such a casual way of telling the scene, and there's tiny little details that sort of suggest the passing of time, or it suggests that something is happening in between the panels, and I love when they do that.
Yeah.
It's something I mentioned to
Read
RJ.
between the panels.
Yeah. And
Pictures
I
between
always
the
tell
panels.
people that too. I said, just because you're reading this doesn't mean it's a comic strip in a newspaper. Usually comic strip in a newspaper is like 3 or 4 panels, and it's like, set the scene, set up the joke, tell the joke, end it. And
Yep.
it's like, we
Same
did
with the
it.
fight.
Yep. And with this, actually, I wouldn't put it past the brothers to actually intentionally place almost everything. I mean, almost everything in every page. They zoom in on characters, they zoom out, they show big scenes, they show, tight, like,
Yeah.
eyebrows
shot.
and just like tension shots of people's faces.
Mhm.
And then all of a sudden the next page is like this big, huge scene of the beach, or like big, huge scene of the jungle. And there's no text on the whole page. There's just people, and there's nothing going on. And then there's a tiny, tiny little text bubble that says, "Isn't life grand?" or something like that,
Yeah.
and you're like, that is just
Or like
a
in the
great
first chapter,
relax.
it says, bang.
Yes. And in the first chapter, there's some violence that happens, and all of a sudden, all the colors change. Everything turns red, and like later on, there's a fire, and everything turns red. Like the sky turns red, and he turns red, and the ground is red. And color is a very easy way to change the mood of a
Yep.
comic.
Like in the fantasy
And they do
world, they use
great.
like their, what was that? What color was that? Purple?
Yeah, when they
Purplish
keep
orange?
bringing it back for,
Yeah.
and they use colors that they haven't used anywhere else.
It's like the sunset. They really capitalize on those colors.
Yeah, and there are some parts too. Oh, I guess I'll mention that later on. I don't want to be like, blah, I'm gonna tell everything right now. But the pacing of the story is so purposeful and so perfect
Yes.
that the artwork matches that feel. And I'm telling you, if you read this, there are people who read Daytripper once a year, and it is definitely.
I will be one of those people.
RJ's got it on his agenda now.
Yes, I already
He's
have
already
a
got
date
the date
plan.
plan.
It's in my phone. It's a reminder. Gonna make sure I take a couple weeks off. Just
Yep.
think about it all over again. But like you were saying, with reading the book and with the pictures involved, it's like you did tell me, like, yes, I understand that you read the book, but are you taking time to look at the pictures, look at the scene, take your time to like observe everything? It's like, how did they get from this point to this point? What happened between this phrase and then this phrase? It's not like they just jump from here to here.
Mhm.
And then you were telling me you can make the book so much bigger than it actually is.
Yep.
Well, and you can make the story your own. You can fill in the gaps, and I would fill in the gaps different than someone else would fill in the gaps. If someone's running through a house or grabbing things, or people are running away, or something's happening in the background, I'll fill in my own story, and it kind of gives you a little bit of that like creative process to, put together what is meaningful in your mind, that you can then build in between the panels. Because Daytripper is all about, taking these lessons and relating them to your own life. And that's, I think, why they say read one chapter a day, because it's like if you just kept reading and reading, you miss pieces or you forget things, or, you start getting tired, or something's happening in the background. And, you need to take these as snippets of people's life, because every day of yours is a snippet of your life.
Yep.
And I think it's purposeful to pace it out.
Yeah. What was your favorite chapter, panel?
RJ goes first.
Yep.
I go first. To be honest, I would have to say the last chapter, and I don't really want to say anything about it, because I literally at the end of the book I was crying, like no joke. Like I was like, how did a book just make me cry? And just like thinking of everything, and then it like, because like I started like referencing it to my life, like everything that has happened in my life. It just related to like so much that has happened, and it was good, like I almost get like choked up thinking about it right now. But I would have to say the last chapter, and there's not a whole lot.
So
I would
each
wanna talk
chapter
about.
is named, obviously chapters 1 through 10, but then he says chapter 10, 76, which is how old he is.
Yeah, in that chapter, they
that
kind of give the age in that
Because it
chapter.
does jump around, so this kind of gives you a little detail of like how old he is.
Kind of grounds it a little bit.
Yeah.
And like RJ was saying, so the last chapter is not necessarily like a culmination of the whole book, because that's typically what a last chapter does. But after a while of just this world, this character, these environments, it just builds and builds and builds into sort of like an ultimate lesson a little bit, where the last chapter says, this is what I want you to take away from these stories. I think it's pretty great that the chapters have his age, and then at the end of the chapter, when he dies, at the end of every chapter, they kind of write a tiny little obituary about him.
How,
I always like that.
Yeah, and it's funny because the obituaries, I think, at that point you start thinking obituaries are like a necessary evil a little bit. Like an obituary is what's, I don't want to say expected, but people use it as closure. And they mentioned that quite a few times in Daytripper, where his boss is like, are you working? And he's like, well, I'm trying. And he's like, people need this. Do your job, get the obituaries in the paper, because people need this closure.
And that was the point where he started taking it seriously.
Yeah. And where he started looking at like, who's going to write my obituary, and I think everyone has that thought, and everyone, kind of says, am I leaving a legacy behind, or am I, if I disappeared tomorrow, who would sort of pen my life for me?
Pick up the pieces. Yeah.
And for Brass, the other intriguing part is they never actually show his death. They never actually
that's true.
Go that distance, and they always sort of show the moment before, or they show like the shocking,
the catalyst of how
or like they give a word or like pan off screen, and then his obituary pops up and says he was a loving father and he always wanted to go, and you're like, oh, okay, like like it gives you a little piece of him, right? Like
I will say my favorite chapter was chapter 5 when he's age 11. I could relate to exactly like growing up and spending time with family all around you. And even though like it seemed like they, be like going to grandma and grandpa's every, once in a while and hanging out and spending time with your family and your extended family and kind of learning life lessons there. And that was the one that really stood out to me. So I loved that. It's great.
And they do touch on my favorite chapter, because I guess I have to answer that one.
Yeah, don't dodge it.
I have to. I will not touch this. I can do this. So I have themes that are carried through. I'm not dodging it. I'm not. There's themes that I carry through where, like, I really enjoyed in some of the chapters where he's older, that he starts doing things that his dad did, and he starts picking up on, like, they smoke the same cigarettes,
Yeah,
right?
I
And then
remember
they are both like writers, and even his mom kind of says, you two are more alike than you think, and at first you kind of see this as a broken relationship, him and his dad, and then you realize, no, he just had different ways of expressing it, and that they were actually very close. And again, these are themes in the book that I'm not hurting the book by saying these
No,
themes,
not at all.
No.
because they're sort of overarching feelings you get when you read the book. But the most important piece in here is the actual writing.
Yes.
And that's why I was finding myself taking screenshots and sort of gathering more of the final chapter myself, because they didn't have the chapter before the final one.
Yeah.
Which was the first chapter that they didn't actually have an age. That was the dream chapter.
Yeah.
And I just thought that was the moment where it just clicked for
Yeah,
me,
chapter
because
one,
it kind of broke out of the, like, here's him going to the supermarket, and then here's him doing this, here's him
the
doing this.
day-to-day life.
Yeah, it kind of broke away from that, and it broke into sort of this dream phase where storylines were crossing, and imagery was sort of merging, and he was older, and the themes when he was older, I guess, just connected to me more than some of the themes earlier on.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of a cultural divide, kinda, because it takes place around the world, and they kind of
It was centralized, I think,
visit
in
that.
Brazil, where they grew up, and kind of explores that.
and everyone has that, like, feel, that
Yeah.
sort of
The
exotic
Brazilian
feel.
feel,
Yeah.
Argentina and stuff like that. So yeah, I think that they did a good job, but even though it's kind of based in Brazil, like, you can still, like, say, oh, this is like in my backyard. This is like what we went through. It's still very
Yeah,
relatable.
Yeah, they definitely do a good job doing that.
And it's not that it's vague,
Yeah.
themes, because it's almost like these are human things. These
Yeah.
are things that everyone goes through, and thoughts that everyone has.
Yeah.
I think, RJ, you liked that part where he saw a girl, and he was sort of in a down time of his life, and then he was like, sees a girl, and then he just, like, leaves thinking about that, and then
Yep.
that's when you're like,
Everything changed.
Yeah.
It was,
Yep.
yeah, it's like he was in this huge funk, and then just like this one moment changes everything. And I think
Yep.
anybody can relate to a
the
situation
supermarket
like
girl.
that.
Yep.
You could be on your way anywhere. You could be something happen, at work, and you're upset about everything, or just something happened in your life where you're just kind of down and out, where you're broke or something. And then just like that one moment, just like a glance at something or
Mhm.
someone, or anything, and that just, your outlook completely changes.
Yeah.
Well,
That
and-
was really cool.
and even their artwork, they can show that just by, like, the slight curve of the eyebrow, or
It was very like movie
tiny,
like,
yeah,
almost.
tiny little, like, instead of drawing straight lips all the time, now these lips are, like, crinkled and furrowed, and you're
Yeah.
like, oh, that emotion is, and it's just like a calligraphy brush almost. I mean, the artwork is just so controlled, but so stylistic. It's like
Mhm.
Yeah.
their thing, and that's kind of what drew me to Umbrella Academy. I did read the Umbrella Academy before I read this, and I thought, gosh, these guys got some skills, because they kind of froze moments in time. And for the Umbrella Academy, and a lot of people have probably seen the show on
Netflix.
is it Netflix?
Yep.
Yeah,
Mhm.
on Netflix. The comic book itself, just because of the nature of a comic book, they freeze these frames. People are, like, flying through the air, or jumping, or
Yep.
like, screaming. And, that's where I say you have to fill in from one panel to the next, because in one panel they're screaming, and the next panel they're not. And you're like, what happened here? So but in Daytripper, every scene they set up is either it's from a shifting viewpoint, like you're inside looking out and now you're outside
Mhm.
looking in, or they have characters that are really only placed for like this one lesson, like this one part, and then you never see them again, but you're like, they were purposeful, right? And it kind of gets you thinking about everyone that you've ever met somehow affected you in some minute, tiny way.
Yep.
And that's where every extra character in Daytripper and every extra scene and everywhere he goes is like, these are what shaped him into the person that he is, no matter how small it is,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
Which segues to my next question. What do you guys think of the relationship between Braz and his best friend Jorge?
Oh, yes.
Very playful in the beginning, but playful, but yet sincere. Jorge definitely pulled Braz out of some funks here and there. When Braz was kind of feeling down and out, his friend Jorge was there to pick him up and like make him laugh and just
Yeah.
like poke fun at him,
Yep.
even though
the
he
most
was down
serious
and
times,
even though he was
whenever
down
he's
and
like,
out.
"Go for it, man."
He's literally just like ragging on him. It's just
Yeah.
like, oh man. It's like, but everybody has, I think everybody has friends like that. I think that's just how friends are. And I think they portrayed it really well. Like you actually felt like these are real people. Like this is how people act. This is how they talk.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Well, and everyone has their own distinct personality, and that's like,
Mhm.
these are how people are.
Yep.
You can't write or draw a character that's the same person. You need someone that's totally separate and in a good way. Jorge actually, I think, was a little like crazy opposite. It's like to the point where he was like,
A hippie.
yeah,
Yeah.
like, or just go with whatever happens today, man.
Yep.
Like, when you walk out your front door, turn right. When you walk out your front door tomorrow, turn left.
Yep.
And just see what happens, right?
Yeah, he constantly
And-
asked him like when he's at his job, he's like, "Are you actually happy? Like,
Yeah.
do you want to do this forever? Because I don't."
Yeah, and he was a photographer, so
Yep.
he's like finding things in life. There's that great scene.
With the lady and they were,
Yeah,
and he was like looking, oh, I know exactly what you're talking about.
it's
Yeah.
a scene that just jumps out because it's one of those, and we can't finish this podcast in any capacity without actually trying to read a moment. But I'm so close to it. I got the next page. Okay, so they meet this girl, and he asks her. He doesn't know what else to say, so he just says, "So what do you do for a living?" And she says, "Why do you ask that?" And he goes, "Well, I don't know. I just met you, and I'd like to know you better, who you are, what you want, and your dreams." And she says, "My job won't tell you who I am, and
Yep.
especially not what I want." And she said, "Look at your friend over there. He is, where is it? Yes, look at your friend over there. That doesn't tell who you really are. I don't know where he works or what he does, but I know he's living this moment and absorbing all that this place has to offer him. I can tell he's not taking pictures because it's his job or because he was told to do that. It's just who he is. And he can find photos for himself." And that's where you get that, like,
Whoa, this is a different book.
yeah. And like, she's telling him, he's merging his job with who he is. And
Yeah.
if they didn't mesh together, then he just wouldn't do it. And on top of that, you can just look at him and see what he does on a daily basis and just how he acts. And that tells you more about who he is than statistics and salary
Yeah,
and
his occupation.
yeah. And that's, a lesson for him, because Brass is very much like, I don't want to say that he wrote obituaries in any kind of like flair or like,
Yeah,
great.
it was his job. He
He just-
took it just as a day job. He's like, oh, this is kind of my stepping stone.
Yeah,
for
and
a
he
job.
felt like he was a wwriter because
Yeah,
his
he was
dad was
kinda
a writer.
stuck.
So he's like,
Yeah.
I'm a writer. And it's like, well, you write obituaries. And the other funny thing is that he's writing obituaries about people that he never
So he couldn't
meant.
relate to him. He
Yep.
couldn't bring the best out of it that he eventually does.
So he did like interviews, right,
Yep.
of people, and then just sort of pieced it together. But most of them are just so generic. They're like, he was a gardener and he was a friend of many people, and
Yep.
he liked going on Sunday to the beach. And you're like, it could just be anybody.
Exactly.
Just put your name
Very
on the top.
generalized. Yeah.
And that's just hard in general, just trying to do something you're not really into or know much about. Like you said, he doesn't know these people. He's not interested in this. Like, this isn't what he wants to do. It's, telling somebody to write a song about something that they've never even experienced. That's probably not going to be the best song in the world.
Yeah.
It's just going to be like, nah,
Yep.
blah. But somebody who writes a meaningful song and who is like a singer songwriter, and they come out with this song, and like you can feel the emotion, and like even if it's not about your life and they're literally singing about a person they know, as a moment they had, you can still relate to that, because it just brings up thoughts in your memory, and you're like, well, I remember this one time, even if it has nothing to do with that song. And I think that's very hard to do if you're not really into something.
Yeah. So I think they both learn a little bit from each other. Him and his best friend, and although I will say Jorge's eventual story that he leads down in the back of his life, I wish it was better. And I appreciated how much support, like even when he lost his friendship with Jorge, even though they would still like communicate every once in a while, and they kind of grew apart, he still hang on, and he wanted to believe him and find him. And I won't spoil the ending of that story, but yeah, that tore me up a bit.
Yeah, and there's other parts in the story where you start relating to a character, and then you're like,
Invested.
you're like, I see a lot of myself in this, right?
Oh.
And then you just start realizing, purposefully how they set up scenes where like Brass has he reacts to a plane crash, and they have a coworker of his who works at the newspapers, and he's just like, this is an amazing story. Oh my gosh, there's so many people that, and you can't help but to just read that and say, well, you're kind of dramatizing tragedy, and we shouldn't do that. But at the same time, there are careers and there are entire industries built around it. So, for us to kind of fall back on our own lives, we have to just think of, okay, I'm only given so many hours during the day. Am I helping or hurting the world? And, am I writing my own, legacy and obituary, or am I just sort of floating through? Because Brass kind of gets to the point where I think he just feels like I'm floating, like I'm just floating, and he's just looking for something. And when you're reading the story, you're like, aha, there's something, that attach yourself to that, and then tragedy, right? Yeah.
Right.
And then like the next chapter, he's like, oh, I've and we don't want to like ruin anything, but he has a good experience in his life, and you're like, wow, that's great. You have a good experience in your life. And it's almost like in the next few pages, it kind of falls apart again. And it's like, and you just want this main character. After a while, he does grow on you, and you just want this main character to succeed.
Yes.
And then you kind of realize that the lesson isn't to succeed in what we think. The lesson is just to live every day,
find some happiness, enjoy the journey.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So after this story then, and that's why we kind of brought RJ on, because it was, for me, it's sort of an affirmation to say there's thousands and thousands and thousands of storylines out there in the world. And it's almost like, there are, I think, a large part of readers who think, oh, there isn't a book out there for me, or there isn't a comic, there isn't a storyline, there isn't a character, there isn't a movie for me. But, there is in the comic book world, there's so many like writers and eras and feels and even just the art. Sometimes people just connect to the art and they're like, yeah, the story was okay, but the art was great.
Mhm.
You kind of can start looking at it that way.
Yeah, definitely. And I I was actually at work and I was talking to one of my coworkers, and she's 70 years old, and I told her which book I was reading. She's like, I'm gonna look that up. And she went ahead and read it, and she doesn't read graphic novels. And she's like, oh, that was a wonderful book. Like, that was great. I told her how to read it. I'm like, just read a chapter a day. And she's like, good, because that's all I have time for. And I was like, okay, well, this book is perfect for you.
Yep.
But
It's a half hour a day, right?
yeah, and then she came back like a couple weeks later, and she's like, I finally finished that book, and thank you for it was kind of nice to be part of that book world. Now you're like, hey, did you read this? Did you read that? So it's kind of cool. Like, I really enjoy reading. I never thought I would say that. Like, I do enjoy reading.
He's back. And I guess in closing, yes. I mean,
Yes.
I want to. There's one part in the back of the book where it's totally independent of the story. It's a page with young Brass and his dad standing, just casually, quietly standing in a field, and his dad's just having a cigarette. And it's just one of those scenes where I think what they're doing is they're honing in on like the quiet times of life. They're showing us these are just regular scenes that happen every day. And, it kind of, to me, related to like this Instagram world and the Facebook world. And everyone thinks, my gosh, your house is always immaculate. And, everyone lives on a beach and there's sunsets all the time. And it's like,
Right.
Wrong.
yeah, there are moments in life that are just normal. And, in comic books and in any kind of artwork, there's some moments where they're just people sitting on a couch, and that's the piece of art, and it's
Mhm.
calming, and there's a reason why so many people like landscapes and just sort of Bob Ross paintings, because it's a moment in time that's just captured. So in the back of this book, there's this scene, and at the bottom, Fabio Moon wrote, "We wanted that feeling that life was happening right there in front of every one of us, and we were living it, and we did live it. And sometimes we die to prove that we lived." And that's kind of the whole point of the book. So
That's the line that gets me every time.
it's good. It's good. It's just the whole point of the book. And so, of course, this is 5 stars from us.
Yes.
Mhm.
Get it in any way you can. Grab it digitally, grab it at the paperback, go to the library. Just about every library has copies of it. And take it from us at the Bam Powell Comic Hour.
Yep. This is your host, Andrew Glonner,
Chris Ramos, and our special guest,
RJ Halstead.
who is also our audio engineer. Thank
yes.
you.
So clean this up.
Will do.
All right. Bye-bye.